They say you should never meet your heroes. Nobody warns you about the absolute horror of the opposite scenario. Nobody prepares you for the soul-crushing reality of being the one man who warned everyone, the one man who stood his ground, being entirely ignored, and then watching the exact catastrophic disaster you predicted unfold right in front of your eyes. A massive 235-foot concrete industrial tower fell the wrong way in the small city of Hargrove, Ohio. It completely crushed the north wing of a regional hospital, and the only person on the entire site who possessed the authority and the knowledge to have stopped it was standing in a deserted parking lot, clutching his unjust termination papers. I still keep that paper in my wallet to this very day. I do not keep it because I need it anymore. The professional certification that defined my entire adult life lapsed a few months after the Hargrove disaster, and I never bothered to renew it. I keep that piece of paper because it constantly reminds me of exactly what it cost to be the one person in the room who actually knew what he was talking about the incident. I was a controlled demolition specialist, level 4. That certification was issued by the highest federal demolition authorities. My name, Elias Thorne, was printed in that clean, official, unfeeling font. The holographic state seal caught the light at certain specific angles. The expiration date on that card came and went while I was sitting in a state investigator's office, methodically explaining how a 49-year-old man gets brutally fired for simply doing his job correctly. It took me 12 grueling years to earn that specific card. 12 long years of working my absolute hardest, clawing my way up from the very bottom of the labor pool. I spent years hauling heavy debris, sweeping toxic slag, and breathing in thick industrial dust that tasted heavily of cold metal and deep regret. It was 12 years of relentlessly studying complex blast patterns, advanced structural load theory, and the unforgiving mathematics of building collapse. 12 years of sitting alone in cheap motel rooms after 14-hour shifts, meticulously reading dry engineering manuals while the rest of the crew drank cheap beer and played loud card games through the thin, poorly insulated walls. I do not say any of this to sound noble or heroic. I state it simply because that is exactly what it takes to reach that level of expertise. That small card in my wallet was not just a simple piece of plastic. It represented 12 years of a man's one and only life. By the time the Hargrove project came around, I had successfully dropped 48 different structures. I had brought down massive brick chimneys, towering radio towers, heavy concrete smokestacks, and even a decommissioned water tower outside of Tulsa that the local mayor had desperately wanted turned into a grand public spectacle. Every single one of those 48 structures went exactly where it was mathematically supposed to go. Every single one fell completely clean. It is not bragging to state these facts. That is simply the baseline standard of the industry. That is what holding a level 4 card truly means. You learn very early in this dangerous line of work that gravity is the actual demolition crew. You do not knock something down by brute force. You gently convince it to fall. You have to read the structure, intimately find its silent language, and deeply understand which way it naturally wants to go. Then, and only then, you use highly calibrated explosives to carefully guide it. It is a calculated nudge, never a violent shove. It is a precise whisper, not a chaotic shout. And if the environmental conditions are not absolutely right, if the wind is blowing wrong, if the ground is soft on one side, if the aging structure has hidden internal weaknesses, you stop everything. You wait. Because gravity does not care about your corporate schedule. Gravity does not care about your bloated budget. Gravity takes that massive building exactly where the unforgiving laws of physics tell it to go. And if you are not there to expertly guide it, it goes wherever it violently pleases, destroying whatever lies in its path. That prestigious card in my wallet meant that I was the one who decided when the conditions were perfectly right. It meant I was the one who held the ultimate safety authority. And tragically, it meant I was the one that Vance Halbeck decided to fire. The Hargrove Industrial Tower stood menacingly on the edge of what used to be a massive coal and power plant. It was 235 feet of heavily reinforced concrete, originally built decades ago, and fully decommissioned in recent years. The city had aggressively bought the land for a lucrative commercial development project. They planned a sprawling strip mall, maybe a massive housing tract. The towering stack had to come down before the eager contractors could break ground and start pouring fresh concrete 235 feet. That is roughly the height of a very tall man standing on top of another tall man, stacked over 30 times into the sky. From the wide concrete base, it looked like a decaying gray finger accusingly pointing at the sky, permanently stained dark on one side from decades of toxic exhaust. Pigeons roosted comfortably in the upper cap. Thick weeds grew aggressively in the deep cracks around the massive foundation. The whole imposing structure had that eerie, dead industry feeling. It was a bleak monument to something that used to matter greatly, now just stubbornly taking up valuable space. The demolition job should have been incredibly straightforward. The plan was to cut the base charge cleanly on the north side, systematically weaken the structure along a precise geometric line, and let the massive stack fall directly north into the empty, barren lot where the massive cooling towers used to stand. It was a perfectly clean drop zone. We had over 400 feet of nothing but soft dirt and old, broken concrete slabs. It was an absolute textbook operation, except, of course, for what sat directly on the south side of the property line. The Hargrove Regional Medical Center. It was a state-of-the-art facility with 310 beds, a fully staffed emergency room, a sprawling pediatric wing, and a brand-new birthing center that had opened just a few months before the demolition contract was ever signed. The massive stack was to fall north, safely away from the hospital, but the total distance between the base of the tower and the hospital's north wall was exactly 406 feet. I meticulously measured it myself with laser precision. 406 feet between 235 feet of rapidly falling concrete and a bustling building full of highly vulnerable people who physically could not run away. There were sick patients trapped in beds, premature babies resting in the intensive care unit, and focused surgeons in the delicate middle of critical operations. The demolition math works exactly like this. A stack that tall falling full length covers 235 feet of solid ground in the precise direction it falls. That leaves exactly 171 feet of safety margin. That is a perfectly sufficient margin if the structure goes exactly where you tell it to go. It is absolutely not enough if it violently disobeys. I confidently signed off on the job because the strict math said it was highly possible. The designated drop zone was completely clear. The concrete structure was structurally sound enough to guide safely, and I had successfully done stacks this tall, with margins this tight many times before. It was not a reckless gamble. It was highly calculated precision work, and precision work requires absolute precision conditions. I emphatically told Vance Halbeck in the very first planning meeting. I repeated it firmly in the second meeting. I officially wrote it in bold ink in the pre-blast assessment report. Wind conditions at the precise time of detonation must absolutely not exceed 12 miles per hour from the south or southeast direction. Any crosswind when pushing the tall stack toward the hospital that exceeds safe parameters means absolute delay protocols must be immediately in effect. Vance Halbeck, the ambitious project manager, signed the official report. I stood there and watched his pen move across the paper as he did it. The day of the event arrived. It was Implosion Day. I was on the site at 5 o'clock in the early morning. The detonation was officially scheduled for exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. That was early enough to beat the Sunday morning traffic crowds, but late enough for proper daylight so the eager local camera crews could get their dramatic footage. The city administration loved a grand spectacle. Explosive demolitions always brought huge crowds of people out of their homes. They had set up a designated public viewing area a safe distance to the east, securely behind a long line of heavy concrete barriers. Local news channels had been relentlessly promoting the event for an entire week. Watch the old Hargrove Tower finally come down. The morning air was incredibly still when I first arrived. It was a cold, dense air, the specific kind of stillness that feels like it is being held in place by some unseen force much bigger than the local weather. I carefully checked the primary anemometer located at the very base of the tower. It read a very calm 4 miles per hour from the northwest. The conditions were absolutely perfect. The massive stack would fall north, and the gentle wind would safely push it further into the designated drop zone. I radioed Vance Halbeck, who was currently sitting comfortably in the warm command trailer near the public viewing area. I clearly stated that the conditions were currently green and that we were fully good to go at 8 o'clock. He acknowledged the transmission with a brief affirmative response. At 7:15 in the morning, I thoroughly checked the wind instruments again. The speed had increased to 6 miles per hour and was slowly shifting toward the west. It was still perfectly fine. It was still well within the strict safety parameters. I felt that familiar, quiet hum of anticipation that I always deeply feel right before a major drop. I was not nervous and I was not overly excited. I was just purely ready. All the explosive charges were perfectly set. The demolition crew had done their meticulous work. Jarek Minsky, a veteran worker, had double-checked every single blast cap himself, and Jarek simply did not miss things. Then, at exactly 7:30, the primary anemometer suddenly twitched. I closely watched the sensitive needle aggressively swing. It hit 9 miles per hour. The direction was now coming from the southwest. I quickly stepped away from the massive stack and checked the secondary portable wind unit I had strategically mounted on the heavy equipment truck. It displayed the exact same alarming reading. The wind was blowing at 9 miles per hour, and the core direction was steadily crawling. It was shifting from southwest, aggressively sliding toward a direct south-southwest trajectory. I immediately grabbed my radio and contacted Vance Halbeck again. I firmly stated that the wind was shifting. It was currently at 9 miles per hour and climbing. I warned him that if it hit a direct south trajectory, we would be completely outside of the safe parameters. There was a long, tense pause on the radio channel. When his voice finally came back, it was flat, annoyed, and completely unhurried. He casually stated that 9 was still well under the 12 limit, and that we were still 30 minutes out from the blast time. I quickly corrected him, reminding him that the hard limit is 12, specifically from the south or southeast. I explained that the wind was currently coming from the southwest and actively moving. I warned that in 30 minutes it could easily become a direct, forceful crosswind aggressively pushing the falling stack directly toward the hospital building. I officially requested to hold the countdown and completely reassess the situation at 7:45. There was another pause. This one was much longer. Over the open radio channel, I could faintly hear the loud noise of the public viewing area located right behind him. The crowds were rapidly gathering. A local news anchor was loudly doing a live television stand-up report. The large crowd had come out early for a spectacular show. Vance Halbeck's voice returned to the radio. He sharply reminded me that we had hundreds of expectant people standing in that viewing area. He pointed out that we had live news crews broadcasting from multiple local stations. He aggressively emphasized that the city council was fully expecting the tower to be completely down by 8 o'clock so they could start their highly publicized press tour and development speech. He incredulously asked me if I was actually telling him that I wanted to delay the entire multi-million-dollar operation just because the wind might potentially shift. I forcefully replied that I was telling him I wanted to delay because the dangerous wind was actively shifting right at this very moment. I told him I was watching the digital numbers climb. Vance Halbeck sighed loudly into the microphone. He dismissed my warning, calling it a gentle morning breeze pushing toward a solid hospital that still had a massive safety margin. The radio aggressively crackled. When he finally spoke again, his voice had taken on that very specific corporate tone. It was the tone that arrogant managers get when they have already firmly made up their stubborn minds and are just aggressively looking for a way to forcefully say it. That sounds somewhat reasonable to the rest of the crew. He made a general announcement to the entire demo crew, ordering everyone not to delay for any wind concerns and confirming that we were absolutely proceeding with the blast at 8 o'clock. I did not waste my breath arguing over the open channel. That is not something I am particularly proud of, nor is it something I am deeply ashamed of the situation. It is simply a cold fact of the situation. In that intense moment, standing alone at the very base of that massive concrete tower, with the digital anemometer actively displaying the danger in my hand and the wind steadily crawling south. I did not argue. I simply stated my firm professional position and calmly waited for the hostile response I already knew was rapidly coming. I clearly announced that I was officially pulling my safety certification. I stated that this demolition drop does not happen without my final safety sign-off. I firmly declared that I would absolutely not sign off on a strong southwest wind that was rapidly trending south, especially not with a fully occupied hospital sitting just a few hundred feet away. There was complete silence on the crew radio. 10 seconds passed, then 15 seconds. When Vance Halbeck's voice finally came back, it was no longer on the open crew channel. It was completely isolated on the private, encrypted line connecting just the two of us. He told me to listen to him very carefully. He aggressively ordered me not to pull anything. He forcefully demanded that I verbally confirm the green safety conditions right then and there. He stated that we were going to drop this tower at exactly 8 o'clock. Just like we had promised the city, just like we had promised the television networks, and just like we had told every single expectant person standing in that VIP viewing area. He demanded to know if I understood his direct order. I calmly and firmly told him no. I explicitly stated that I would absolutely not confirm green conditions because the current conditions were not green. They were firmly yellow and rapidly trending toward red. Vance Halbeck snapped. He angrily declared that he would just confirm the safety conditions himself. I quickly reminded him that he did not possess the required state certification. I told him he legally could not confirm blast safety conditions. I reminded him that it was a strict federal regulation. You absolutely need a certified level 4 expert on site to legally sign off on the final countdown. Vance's voice turned ice cold. He told me that he did have a certified expert on site until about 30 seconds ago. It took my brain a brief moment to fully process what his words actually meant. I realized he was firing me right there on the spot. He officially declared that he was completely releasing me from the project, effective immediately. He stated that my professional services were no longer required on his site. He smugly added that he would simply document the incident by stating I had voluntarily abandoned the job site without authorization, and that he would happily clean up the messy corporate paper trail later. He confidently claimed that Jarek Minsky could simply confirm the wind conditions instead, noting that Jarek had been doing this job long enough. I desperately reminded him that Jarek did not hold any legal certification. Vance retorted that Jarek possessed decades of practical experience, which he claimed was worth far more than a simple plastic card in my wallet. He then aggressively ordered me to clear out of the area immediately, giving me exactly 5 minutes before he called the site security to physically remove me. I stood there frozen for a long time. It was probably not 5 minutes. It was maybe 2 long minutes. The cold wind heavily pressed against my worn face, and I could physically feel the dangerous direction shifting the exact same way a seasoned sailor can feel a dangerous tide rapidly change. The wind was moving from the southwest directly to the south. I felt the physical pressure change before the digital anemometer even confirmed it. I slowly turned and walked to my heavy work truck. I silently packed my specialized gear into the front cab. I slowly drove past the crowded public viewing area, past the tall antenna news vans, past the excited local families, holding steaming coffee cups and expensive cell phones raised high in the air, all completely ready to capture the exciting spectacle. Nobody in the crowd looked at me twice. Why would they? To them, I was just a random construction worker leaving a little bit early. I drove my truck to a massive empty retail parking lot located several miles directly away from the demolition site. It was close enough to easily hear the massive detonation, but far enough away that I could not physically see the towering structure. I sat alone in the cold truck with the heavy engine turned off and the communication radio still quietly turned on. Vance Halbeck's voice sharply crackled through the small speaker, sounding incredibly calm and commanding, perfectly playing the authoritative role he had been handsomely hired to play. He called for all personnel to perform final checks. He confirmed the explosive charges were live. He proudly announced that detonation would occur in exactly 12 minutes. Jurek Minsky's nervous voice came through next. He nervously confirmed the charges were set and the sequence was green. There was absolutely no mention of the rapidly deteriorating wind conditions. There was no mention of the mandatory certification safety hold. There was no mention of the senior safety expert who had just been forcefully removed from the dangerous site. Jarek read the standard checklist exactly, like it was just any other normal day, and I deeply understood a horrible truth in that exact moment that I had not fully grasped before. Jarek was absolutely not going to stop the countdown. Neither was any other member of the crew. The workers blindly trusted the established corporate system, and the physical embodiment of that system was Vance Halbeck. Vance had aggressively decided that the massive tower was coming down at exactly 8 o'clock, and a stubborn man with a plastic card in his wallet had been the absolute only thing standing in the destructive way of that terrible decision. Now, that man was sitting helplessly in a desolate parking lot, holding a verbal termination that he had not even received on official paper yet. I desperately thought about calling someone for help. I thought about calling the city administration, the local police, the hospital administration, or a federal safety hotline. But who do you possibly call at 7:50 in the morning on a quiet Sunday to urgently tell them that a highly publicized demolition event is about to go horribly wrong? What tangible proof do you currently have in your hands? You are just a man who was literally just fired. You are a man who, according to the official paperwork that Vance would soon file, had cowardly walked off the crucial job. You would just sound like a deeply disgruntled former employee holding a petty personal grievance, not a desperate prophet frantically shouting a legitimate warning. I angrily turned the radio off in frustration. Then, a few seconds later, I quietly turned it back on. I simply could not stop myself from listening to the unfolding disaster. The final countdown officially began. Detonation in 10 minutes. I tightly gripped the hard steering wheel and stared blankly at the digital clock on the dusty dashboard. The bright sun was fully up by now, casting a pale, cold morning light, the specific kind of harsh light that makes everything look like it is silently holding its nervous breath. Detonation in 5 minutes. All personnel must retreat to designated safe zones. I slowly closed my tired eyes. In my mind's eye, I could perfectly see the towering stack. I could visualize the precise placement of the explosives along the massive base. I had personally placed every single one of them just 2 days before, with Jarek quietly handing me the caps from the bright orange storage crate. They were perfectly clean cuts, with precise north-facing notches. The massive concrete tower naturally wanted to fall directly north. The heavy structure organically leaned that way naturally, as the concrete was slightly thicker on the southern side due to decades of intense heat expansion from the industrial furnaces. The powerful charges would carefully guide it. They were specifically designed by me to safely guide it. But explosive charges can only gently guide a structure. They absolutely cannot forcefully override the laws of physics. A significantly strong enough crosswind forcefully pushes the massive bulk of the concrete as it falls through the air. It is usually not much, and it is usually not enough to matter on a wide-open, empty demolition site with hundreds of yards of safe clearance. But on an incredibly tight site with only slightly over 100 feet of safety margin, a 15-mile-per-hour sudden gust of wind blowing directly from the south, hitting over 200 feet of rapidly falling solid concrete broadside, could easily shift the final drop point by 50 feet or more. It could easily be enough to cause absolute catastrophe. Detonation in 2 minutes. Final radio silence protocols engaged. The radio channel went completely dead, leaving just a faint electronic static, and then nothing at all. I sat entirely alone in the suffocating silence of my truck cab and just listened to the rapid sound of my own anxious breathing. At exactly 8 o'clock, I physically felt the massive blast before my ears actually heard it. It was a profound, deep vibration traveling through the solid ground, low and incredibly powerful, feeling exactly the way distant thunder feels vibrating deep inside your own chest cavity. Then came the terrifying sound itself. It was a massive, sharp, defining crack that sounded terribly final, exactly like the sound of the entire world violently breaking a massive bone. There was a brief, terrifying pause, and then came the deafening roar. Thousands of tons of solid concrete and thick steel were rapidly giving way. Over 200 feet of massive structure was completely surrendering to the absolute power of gravity. It is the distinct, terrifying sound of something unfathomably massive violently tearing through the helpless air. The entire fall should have taken approximately 8 seconds. A stack of that incredible height in absolute free fall forcefully hits the solid ground in just about 8 seconds. I silently counted in my head 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The deafening roar absolutely did not stop. In fact, it horribly changed its tone. It rapidly transitioned from the clean, heavy rumble of a perfectly planned structural collapse into something much wilder and vastly more chaotic. It became a horrific grinding, tearing, screeching sound of massive destruction that I had absolutely never heard before in all of my 48 previous drops. That specific terrible sound meant the massive structure was fundamentally not falling as one solid, cohesive piece. It meant the thick concrete base had sheared completely unevenly. It meant the dangerous wind had successfully gotten aggressively under the falling mass. Or the complex charges had critically misfired out of their strict sequence. Or something else entirely. Whatever it was, something had gone catastrophically wrong. And then, almost immediately, the sirens started howling. It was not the demolition crew's standard all-clear safety siren. These were loud emergency sirens. I heard ambulances, heavy fire trucks, and police cruisers, a massive, terrifying chorus of them, rapidly rising up from the immediate direction of Hargrove City Center. They were all desperately heading directly from the location of the hospital. They were rushing directly toward the absolute disaster I had been desperately warning about since early that morning. I frantically slammed the key into the ignition and turned the truck on. I violently pulled out of the parking lot, my tires aggressively screeching on the cold pavement. I drove dangerously fast directly toward the terrifying sound of the sirens. I could not get very close to the actual site. The local police had already efficiently sealed off a massive 4-block radius around the disaster zone. Every single road I desperately turned down had a heavy police cruiser aggressively parked diagonally across it, its bright lights frantically flashing, and a stern officer standing firmly in the road, forcefully waving people back away from the danger. I aggressively parked my truck 3 blocks directly north of the hospital and quickly jumped out. The thick, choking dust was literally everywhere. It was a fine, heavy gray powder completely coating car hoods, entire sidewalks, and the green leaves on the old oak trees that lined the quiet residential streets. It looked exactly like toxic snow that had fallen completely wrong, not clean and white, but heavy gray and entirely unnatural. Terrified people were standing outside on their front porches wearing bathrobes and slippers, staring south in absolute shock toward the massive rising cloud of destruction. Some frantic people had phones pressed tightly to their ears. Some just stood completely frozen, staring with their mouths hanging wide open in pure horror. I started walking. I absolutely did not have a coherent plan. I just blindly walked directly toward where the choking dust was the thickest, desperately heading toward where the deafening sirens were the absolute loudest. A heavily geared firefighter aggressively stopped me at the main corner intersection. He sternly yelled that I could not go any further, stating it was a highly restricted emergency disaster zone. I stammered, my voice sounding incredibly foreign and completely hollow. I told him I was a senior member of the demolition crew. It was the very first time I had spoken out loud since I sat alone in the distant parking lot, and my own voice sounded like it belonged to a complete stranger. I desperately pleaded that I urgently needed to see what happened. He looked at me incredibly hard, his eyes rapidly searching my face, and then something fundamental shifted in his stern expression. Maybe it was the deep desperation in the way I said it. Maybe it was the thick concrete dust already heavily coating my worn work boots, or maybe it was the simple fact that both of my hands were violently shaking. He slowly stepped aside. He pointed toward a nearby church and strictly told me to go no further than that parking lot, promising I would easily be able to see the devastation from there. I definitely could see it. The massive concrete stack had violently fallen directly south. It was not just a minor drift or a slight, unexpected nudge. It had violently gone almost entirely south, looking exactly like a massive tree that was maliciously felled in the absolute wrong direction by an incredibly careless, reckless logger. The very base of the structure was still standing, appearing as a jagged, broken stump of concrete. There was maybe 40 feet of the thick base completely sheared off at a highly unnatural, terrifying angle that my experienced eyes recognized instantly. That specific, violent angle definitively meant the primary north charges had successfully fired as planned, but the towering structure had violently twisted mid-air as it fell. The strong southern wind had forcefully caught the massive upper section, exactly like a gigantic concrete sail, violently pulling the millions of pounds of mass violently sideways. Over 200 feet of heavily reinforced, solid concrete had violently swung across those 406 feet of open space and come crashing down directly onto the north wing of the Hargrove Regional Medical Center. The north wing was exactly where the pediatric ward was located. I could clearly see the exact point of the catastrophic impact. There was a massive, horrifying gash violently torn completely through the hospital roof. The entire exterior wall had completely collapsed inward, spilling thousands of tons of heavy debris directly into what had previously been a healing building and was now just a massive bleeding wound of twisted metal and crushed concrete. Bright red emergency lights frantically flickered from deep inside the darkness of the ruined structure. Powerful flashlights frantically moved behind completely shattered hospital windows. The thick, choking dust was so incredibly dense around the central impact zone that it looked exactly like heavy fog. Through the thick haze, I could barely make out the frantic shapes of desperate people running everywhere. There were brave firefighters in heavy yellow coats, frantic paramedics pushing bloody stretchers, and terrified hospital nurses wearing scrubs that were still stained with their early morning coffee. Someone in the distance was screaming hysterically. It was not just one single son. It was a horrific, sustained sound that rose up from the chaotic scene like heat rising from burning asphalt. It was a massive, collective voice of absolute shock, deep pain, and complete confusion that blended together into one incredibly sustained, agonizing note of pure human suffering. I stood completely frozen in that small church parking lot, completely unable to move. I watched the absolute nightmare unfold, and something deep inside my soul broke completely clean through. It was not my professional spirit that broke. It was not my personal will to live. It was something much smaller and far more essential. It was the core thing that had allowed me to sleep peacefully every single night after 48 perfectly clean drops.